Welcome back to the Metzger Collection. Today we are going to be looking at enculturated portrayals of Jesus, which will conclude our Faces of Jesus series. In our Western society, we are used to seeing Jesus portrayed as a white person. While it isn't historically accurate, it actually holds validity as an enculturated portrayal of Jesus, which is where we see Jesus coming into our own context and culture. Initially, the modern missionaries sought to introduce a European Christ to all the people that they encountered, as if this is a way that Jesus was meant to be for all cultures and all people. A lot of credit goes to those modern missionaries who sought to see Jesus in the skin and clothing and symbolism of the people that they were serving. The mission of enculturating Jesus is very important even to today, because Jesus wasn't just a person who entered history for a particular amount of time and then he died and he left, but he still lives and he lives within us, and he impacts people and across time and culture. The artistic endeavor to portray Jesus within other cultures has been likened to the translation of the Bible into different languages, because both share the goal of allowing people to connect and understand the character of Christ in a way that is relatable to them. Back in the 16th century, missionaries who came to Japan presented a European Christ, and one steeped in European tradition. And so this was what they were introduced to, but also these missionaries encouraged Japanese converts to completely cast away their own traditions. And this led many to struggle with reconciling the culture which they held dear to their heart, but also this European religion, which was also profoundly important to them. This icon uses Japanese imagery of compassion and enlightenment to talk about Jesus. Here he is shown as a Japanese man sitting on a golden lotus blossom in the traditional posing of a Bodhisattva, who is an enlightened one, opening the way for others to come into enlightenment. This is a very unique portrayal, and I'm sure that we can see some parallels to Jesus being the one who opens the way for us to come to the Father. And this is what I appreciate about this piece, is that it puts the gospel into almost another language, the language of art, for other people to understand. If I said that I was going to talk about a Last Supper painting, probably the first thing that would pop into mind would be like Da Vinci's Last Supper or another number of European portrayals of the Last Supper. But today we're going to talk about a Chinese depiction of the Last Supper. This picture here is a segment showing Christ and St. John, taken from a larger picture of the Last Supper. We don't know much about the artist or the background of this painting. All we know is that it was done by a 19th century group of Chinese artists called the Chinese School. But what is very fascinating about this piece is that it shows Jesus dining in Oriental style with place settings including chopsticks. This Ethiopian image of the Transfiguration comes from the Ethiopian Gospels, which is a 16th century manuscript written in the language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's traditional liturgical language. This is an enculturation in both word and an image. There are 11 full-page miniatures within this manuscript, which both illustrate the height of the Gunde Gunde art style, which is characterized by the detailed linear motifs and bold blocks of color. This painting was adapted from a piece from the Jesus Mappa series done by Northern Cameroon artists. This was an original commissioned by a Malawian artist to portray the baptism of Christ within the Malawian context. Here the scene is set in the Shire River and features the traditional Malawian clothing and boats. Here I am going to show two different pictures side by side and give a more detailed explanation of the story behind them. Here is Warner Solomon's Head of Christ, which is a very prolific image in North American society. It is attributed as being the one to mislead everyone to think that Jesus was white. And then here is, beside it is a parody of the picture showing Jesus as a black man in the same positioning, clearly alluding to Solomon's Head of Christ. And this was done as part of an ad campaign by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. Solomon's Head of Christ was one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It has been reproduced at least 500 million times since its creation in 1940. The first version of this portrait was done in 1924 for his commission piece to the cover of the Covenant Companion. Struggling for ideas to fulfill this commission, one night Solomon envisioned Christ in his dream. Awakening in the night, he sketched a face of Christ, and in the morning did a life-size charcoal version for the magazine, which was under the title Son of Man. Later, in 1940, he painted a portrait in oil, which launched his career and the popularity of the painting. Solomon identified himself as a graphic artist, and although his work was ignored by the fine art world, he's quoted to have said that, "I believe that the Lord has given me a job to do, of pointing people to Christ through the medium of art." His deep faith is evident in the reverent ways that he portrayed Christ. The widespread recognition of the head of Christ was largely due to the distribution of this portrait to soldiers fighting in World War II, and as well as Solomon giving chalk talks to many churches, where he would preach while drawing his head of Christ, then donate the portrait to the church. Although Solomon influenced the North American misconception that Jesus was white, his head of Christ became a Christ who was relevant and comforted the people of North America through the tumultuous atmosphere that they faced. The black head of Christ portrayal mirrors the position of Solomon's head of Christ. It was part of an ad campaign, Faith, Hope, and Love, in 2009 by the Helsinki parishes of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. This poster was entered in several advertisement competitions bearing the caption, "Room for the faith that you consider yours." This statement encourages one to be receptive to a faith that is beyond their own understanding and experience, as well as to create space for others to make Jesus their own. These two pictures showcase something very valuable. It showcases the inculturation and the understanding of making one's faith their own. Solomon obviously was an American white man who portrayed Jesus in this way because this is the way that Jesus understood. And I think together these pictures give a very beautiful image of not only making room for the faith that is our own, but also, as Solomon said, pointing people to Christ through art requires that people understand and relate to the Christ portrayed in art. So together these share a pretty powerful message. This painting was done by the same artist who did the Dorothy Day icon that I highlighted in my last video. And together these two share a very similar image. This painting portrays the flight to Egypt within a modern context of the plight of the Syrian refugees. It reminds us back to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says that what you do for the least of these is what you do for me. And so this calls us to see the face of Christ in those who are displaced from their homelands for a variety of reasons. And not only should we see the face of Christ in them, but we should welcome them with open arms, for it is in these moments that we also welcome Christ. Remembering that Jesus was a refugee in his infancy is not only a very sobering thought, because for sure that was a very troubling circumstance, but it also reminds us that Jesus understood our humanity and he understood our suffering. This icon, Christ in the desert, intends to step back into the culture that Jesus originally came from. Although the Semitic roots of Jesus' own culture have been largely overshadowed by Greek and Latin cultures, they are still equally important. This icon celebrates the richness found in Syriac churches that still use Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, as their own primary language of worship. As such, the Greek and Latin traditional inscriptions on the icon have been written now in Aramaic, stating Jesus Christ at the top and Christ the desert at the bottom. This next piece, Quetzalcoatl Christ, demonstrates the meshing of Mesoamerican culture with Christianity, and this piece in particular raises the question of where is the line between inculturation, bringing Christ into the culture, and syncretism, where there's no more definition between Christianity and the culture that it came into. So we're going to take a closer look at this one. This icon is a dual icon for both Christ and a Mesoamerican spiritual figure whose story is reminiscent of that of Jesus. His name is Quetzalcoatl, which means plumed serpent, and he is described as a creator who is able to reconcile both heaven and earth to himself. He appears in the 10th century AD as a priest who opposes the practices of human sacrifice and warfare, which dominated worship in the Valley of Mexico. While this priest drew a large number of followers, those in the ruling class disliked him and condemned him to death by consumption of a sacred fire. Quetzalcoatl then raises from the dead, becomes young again, and his heart becomes the morning sun. He left promising to return to his people. As we can see, the stories of Quetzalcoatl and Christ are very similar. The artist of this icon comments that Quetzalcoatl and Christ bring us the same timeless message. God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. In both their lives, our human condition has been joined inseparably to the divine. Each proclaims to us a simple gospel of compassion and invites us to dance with God in the divine fire burning within each of our hearts. This resurrection icon portrays them as the same person with a fiery heart being raised from the flames of death and rebirth. A plumed serpent in gold encircles the figure, while the red and black represent the morning star in the Aztec tradition. The striking lithograph by Roy Henry Vickers is in First Nation style, is a meditation on how believers are connected to Christ. Here we see the suffering face of Christ in red on the left, and the living face of Christ on the right in black. Red and black are both very traditional colors for Northwest First Nations art. And it is in that style, of course. This image reflects the connection we have to Christ in two ways. First, with the suffering face of Christ, we can identify with Christ in his crucifixion and his suffering, but we can also identify with Christ in his resurrection and his offer of everlasting life. This is partly a meditation on 2 Timothy 2:11, which states, "Surely I tell you, if we die with Christ, then we will also live with Christ." The final piece in today's tour is a depiction of the Trinity through the First Nation style of the Crow Nation, seeking to illuminate the importance and theological relevance of the Trinity within the symbolism of their own culture. This is actually one of my favorite pieces that was in this section of the exhibit, so we're going to take a closer look at this one. The Holy Spirit is represented by an eagle, regarded as one of the most holy of birds. Its wings curve downwards to encompass the figures of Jesus and God, which communicates the union between Father and Son. As such, God is represented as a sage elder, who is all-knowing. Jesus is depicted in the attire of a warrior, wearing a tanned hide shirt decorated with porcupine quills, glass beads, and ermine fur. Interestingly, ermine fur was actually worn to communicate that one was a great warrior who had taken his enemy's gun. Through this light, we can comprehend Jesus through the lens of a great warrior who has disarmed death and denies it the final blow. So this piece is one of my favorites in this part of the collection because I think it was one of the very first ones that really made me understand what enculturation was and why it was important. As you can imagine, or if you are part of the Crow Nation and this is part of your symbolism, to understand that symbolism but then have it applied to Jesus and to God and to the Trinity, that would make the idea of the Trinity that much more profound and that much more impactful. And so it's just a very beautiful way to depict Jesus as the one who has disarmed death, denied it the final blow, with that symbolism. And that is it for today's tour at the Metzger Collection. This also concludes our Faces of Jesus series. So don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with your friends and family. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss next week's mini tour. See you guys next week!